So this is section 1.7. This is the second part of 1.7 and last part. So notice in this example number 5, we are solving an inequality just like the others, but notice it is a quadratic inequality. Well, remember when we solve quadratics, we get two solutions. So that's going to mess us up a little bit. We can't just say, oh, it's to the right of that or to the left of it. We're going to have two solutions. So we are going to solve this. This time we are going to solve it using a positive negative chart. Okay, in chapter 2, we're going to solve it using our calculator, but I want to show you how to do it using positive negative chart. And on your test, you will need to be able to solve 1 or 2 or 3 of them using a positive negative chart. Okay, but the first thing we're going to do is and here's our steps, but we're going to solve it as though it was an equal mark. So we're going to pretend this is an equal mark, and we're going to go ahead and solve it. Now we could factor it, quadratic formula, completing the square. The easiest, though, is to factor, and this one does factor. So I'm going to factor that guy. Remember the 15, we've got 1 and 15, or 3 and 5, and what subtracts to give me 2 is my 3 and my 5. So I'll have my 3, my 5. I'm going to go ahead and say that's equal to 0. So when I do that, I need a -2. So that gives me a -5 here, a +3 there. So my two possible answers are x is -3 and x equals 5. You could set those equal to 0 if you wanted to. Okay, so we have answers if it's equal to. Now we've got to figure out the answer since it says less than or equal to. Well, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put these two answers on my number line. So I'm going to put a -3 here and a +5 there. Notice that separates this into, 3 parts, right? So we've got 3 parts right here. So now I'm going to write those parts in interval notation. So this part from negative, notice it's going forever in the negative direction. So that's going to go from negative infinity all the way up to my -3. -3, and I always just go ahead and put parentheses around those. The answer may or may not have parentheses, but we're going to put parentheses. Then if I shade it in here, notice this would be an in-between graph. So that's going to be from -3 to 5. -3 to 5. I'm going to put parentheses around those. And then the last part, we're going to go from 5 to forever. So that's going to be from 5 to infinity. And again, I put parentheses around those. So the answer to this equation, this inequality, is going to be one or more of these interval notations. Okay? So this right here is going to be your answer in some way, shape, or form. So now we've got to figure out which ones are going to be the answer. And the way you do that is first look at your actual inequality up here. Notice it says less than or equal to 0. So if it is less than 0, is that a positive number or a negative number? Less than 0 is going to be negative. Okay, so your answer is going to be either negative or equal to 0, right? So either less than or equal to my 0. Okay, so now I'm going to just get a test point. Okay, so I'm just going to grab any number in my first interval. So a -4 would work, -5, -10, -1,000. I usually just pick like a -10. I'm going to do that in different colors so you know it's my test point. All right, so I'm going to test -10. I'm going to plug it in to my original. That I can either plug it into that or I can plug it in to my factored form, and I think it's easier to plug it into my factored form. So if I plug negative 10 right here, all I care about is it positive or is it negative? Okay, so in my mind, I'm saying negative 10 plus 3. Okay, but I don't care that it's negative 7. All I care about is that it's a negative number. And then I'm going to plug it in here as well. So I get what, negative 10 plus 5. Oops, that's minus 5, sorry. Negative 10 minus 5. And that is also a negative number. Well, what's a negative times a negative? That's going to give me a positive. So what that means is no matter what number I picked from negative infinity to right before we get to negative 3, so anything in here, if I plug it into my original, I'm going to get a positive number. All right, I'm going to do the exact same thing for the second one. I'm going to pick the easiest number to plug in, which I think is 0. If 0's in there, easiest number to plug in. So I could plug it into my factored form like I did with the first one, but I think it's easier to plug it into the original, because if I plug zeros in, anytime there's an X, that's a 0. Anytime there's an X, that's a 0. So the only thing left is this negative 15. Again, I don't care that it's a negative 15. I care that it's negative. So any number that I plug in this interval is going to give me a negative answer. And then I just need to grab a number on the right. Anything bigger than 5 will work. Again, I'm just going to plug in a regular old 10. So in my head, I'm saying 10 plus 3. I don't care that it's 13. I care that it's positive. And then I say 10 minus 5. I don't care that it's 5, but I care that it's positive. And a positive times a positive is a positive. So what that tells me is that any number that I plug in on the left is going to give me a positive answer. Any number I plug in that's in the middle gives me a negative answer. And any number I plug in on the right is going to give me a positive answer. I care about that because I know that my answer to this has to be less than or equal to 0. It has to be negative or 0. Now, which one of these was negative? Looking down there. The only one that's negative is this part in here, right? That's my negative. So that tells me that my answer is going to be negative 3 to 5. Now notice I didn't automatically put my parentheses, okay? Didn't automatically put my parentheses because it could be or equal to 0. Now if I plug in a negative 3 into either the top, the first one, x squared minus 2x minus 15, that's going to give me a 0. I know that because I solved it to give me a 0, right? Or I could plug it into this part, and notice when I plug it in, the first one, I get a 0. So negative 3 works. It gives me or equal to 0. So that is included. I'm going to put a bracket there. 5, I do the exact same thing with 5. When I plug 5 in, notice if I put it here, I get a 0. So it says it could be or equal to 0. So my 5 works also. So that's a bracket. So my final answer for this is that interval notation, which would be anything between negative 3 and 5 and including negative 3 and 5. If I had graphed this original equation, x squared minus 2x minus 15, I would have gotten this graph down here on the left. Now notice that it said it needed to be less than or equal to 0. So do you notice that here, down here, that's going to be my less than 0, and above it, this is my greater than 0. So that's my positive ones, and this is my negative ones. And I want what's negative. So it's going to be all of this under here, right? Not that on the right-hand side. Let me get rid of that. So everything, all of this would be what is negative. Any number that I plug in here is going to give me something negative. So again, if I plug in a 0, let's see, when I plug in 0, I get this number down here. Notice it is a negative number. If I plug in 1, I'm going to get a 0. If I plug in 2, I'm going to get a 0. All of these, excuse me, not 0, I'm going to get a negative number. If I plug in -1, I get negative. If I plug in 5, I get a 0. And if I plug in -5, I get a 0. So graphing, and this is what we're going to do in chapter 2, we're going to graph these guys, and you can just look at the graph and say, oh, when it's negative, it's below the graph, below this x-axis. Okay, so that is a good way to just check. If you already know how to use your graphics calculator, you can check, and these things are the same. So they check out. Okay, let's do one more. Notice this is something squared. So I'm going to pretend it's an equal mark, right? And I'm going to solve it. So if I have 3x squared minus 11x minus 4 equals 0, again, I like slide and divide. So I'm going to slide my 3 over there. X squared minus 11x, what's that? Minus 12. So I can actually factor that out. So that would factor into what 1 and 12 gives me 12 and subtracts to give me 11. So this one's going to be negative. The 12's negative. The 1's positive. I'm not done yet, right? Because it's called slide and divide. Slide and divide. And divide is the part that people forget to do. So I'm going to divide each piece by the number that I slid, which is my 3. So I wind up with, I could bring the 3 back around, but since I'm solving it, I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to leave it as 1/3. And here I'm going to have x minus 4. So this solution is x is -1/3, and this solution is x is 4. So I've solved it, but notice that my problem had an inequality. When you have an inequality, you have to go into the positive negative chart. So let's come over here and let's put -1/3 and 4 on my number line. Notice I'm not actually counting 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, making sure it's right at -1/3. That does not matter. Now I'm going to write my interval notation on top. So everything on the left of -1/3 is going to be negative infinity to -1/3, and I put my parentheses. In between, my in between is going to be -1/3 to 4, put my parentheses, and the last part is 4 to infinity. So I now know that these are my answers, okay? I just don't know which ones are going to work. I find them out by looking at what I have been given. So it is not an equal mark. Instead, it is a greater than 0 sign. So greater than 0 means it has to be, is it positive or negative? Greater than 0 means it's going to be positive. Does it have an equal mark? It does not. So not equal, okay? So not equal to 0. So it has to be positive, but not 0. So once again, we're just going to plug in some numbers. So let's say negative, I'll do -10 again. Again, I do not want to actually plug in -10, okay? I just want to come down here and I'm going to use my, my factored form, okay? Let's look at the first one. And again, you don't have to write this down. I would write it down in your notes, but I'm plugging it in here, x plus 1/3. Okay, so if I put a -10 in there, that's going to give me a negative, right? Negative 10 plus a little bit more, it's going to be negative. And then on the other part, that's going to be x minus 4. So I'm going to put the 10 in there. So 10 minus 4, that's going to be a positive number. So that anything that I put in that interval is going to give me a negative times a positive. That's going to give me something negative. All right, now let's plug in a number in between negative something and positive something. That's always going to be a 0. 0 is the easiest to plug in. When I plug in a 0, I always do it in the given one. Now, you could do it down here like I did with the factored form, but it's easier to do it with the given because anything that has an x, whoops, sorry about that, anything that has an x is going to disappear. So, essentially, the 3x squared's gone, the minus 11x, the only thing I have left is a negative 4. So, notice that that is a negative. So that's going to give me a negative there. All right. And then finally, I'm going to plug in a positive number, something in between 4 and infinity. So that's going to give me a 10. So let me plug in a 10. And once again, when you plug that in, you don't want to actually literally plug it in. All you're going to do is figure out is it going to be positive or negative? So let's plug in 10, and I'm going to plug it in here. 10, positive 10 plus a little bit more, that's going to be a positive. And then the second one, positive 10 minus 4, that's going to also be a positive. That makes me think a little bit. Let me come back over here. I think I made a boo-boo. Right here, when I plug in a negative 10, and a little bit more, that's still going to be negative. But here, when I plug in a negative 10 and minus 4 more, that's going to be a negative. So I meant that should have been a negative here instead of a positive. That's a negative. So negative plus a negative, negative times a negative is a positive. Sorry about that. Anyway, and my far right, a positive times a positive is a positive. Okay, so we can split these. Notice we've split these into 3 parts. I've got the left-hand side. Anything I put there is going to give me a positive. The middle is going to give me a negative, and anything I put on the right is a positive. Now the question is, which ones were we wanting? We wanted something that was positive. So that's going to be this part here. That's positive, and this part here. So my graph would be anything on this side and anything on that side. So I need to write my intervals. So my answer is going to be negative infinity to negative 1/3. I'll come back and put well, let's look right now. What is going to get parentheses and what gets a bracket? Parentheses always goes to infinity, okay? But notice if I put in a negative 1/3, we solved it so that negative 1/3 is the answer to this guy, right? Where it is equal to 0. So these will give you 0. And I don't want a 0, so I'm going to put a parentheses here, okay, because it's not 0. And then on the other side, I'm going to have 4 to infinity. Infinity always gets a parentheses. And again, we do not want a 0, so that 4 is going to get a parentheses. And then I always put my Matthew in the middle. Again, my lab may ask for a comma, so just pay attention to that. Okay, last, example number 7. I almost forgot about example number 7. So we need to find the height of a projectile. Okay, if a projectile, I told you we're going to be throwing things a lot. Okay, if a projectile is launched from ground level with initial velocity of 144 feet per second, its height, S, once again, if it's okay with y'all, I'm going to change that to H because I like height to be H. Anyway, the height H in feet, T seconds after launching is given by that equation. And once again, I told you this one is how hard that ball is kicked, and that always goes here. And then this is gravity. And since it's negative 16, we know that we are in America. We are no longer over in Europe. You also know that because it says feet per second. Anyway, it's asking, when will the projectile be greater than 128 feet above the ground? 128 feet. So I'm going to write my equation, minus 16t squared plus 144t. They want to know when, and notice that's my height. They want to know when is it greater than 128. So that height is going to be greater than 128. So we now have this equation, or inequality, excuse me. We've got that inequality. So to solve it, we're going to move that 28 to the other side by subtracting it. And then we just have to solve it. Again, we're going to set it equal to 0, okay? Think of it as equal to 0. And I'm going to factor out something if I can. And I actually can factor out, 16 goes into all of those. Actually, negative, we're going to factor out a negative so that I wind up with just my t squared. That's going to make it much easier to work with. So negative 16 times negative 9t is going to give me a positive 144t. And then negative 16 times positive 8 will give me a negative 128. And again, I'm going to set that equal to 0. And this actually, I can factor. I'll leave my negative 16, I guess. 1 times 8 gives me 8, and it adds to give me 9. They both have to be negative. So I actually have two answers, which makes sense because I have t squared. So I've got one where t is 1, and this one is t is equal to 8. Okay, now this one, negative 16 equals 0. Negative 16 doesn't equal 0, so I don't have to worry about that. I have my two answers, my 1 and my 8. I put those, since we're dealing with an inequality, right? I put those on my chart, on my positive negative chart. I'm now going to write my inequality, my interval notation. So anything to the left of 1 is negative infinity to 1. In between is what? 1 to 8. And then to the right-hand side is 8 to forever. So now we've got to figure out the sign in there, right? So let's plug in a number again. Look, 0's in here. So I'm going to put my 0 in that one. Again, when I plug in 0, you can plug it in here, okay? Or I find it easier to plug it in the original, because that means these guys and those guys are just going to disappear, and I just have a negative 128 left. So anything that I put in on in that interval is going to give me a negative number. Now let's plug in a number, any number between 1 and 8, maybe a 5. It doesn't matter. You can plug in anything. I think it's probably easiest to plug it in right here. So I'm going to plug it in there. So 5 minus 1 is going to give me a positive. And 5 minus 8, that's going to give me a negative. So a positive times a negative. Let me look at that again. Oh, I almost forgot. Whew, it's getting close. I was plugging it just into this. Notice there is a negative out there. So a negative, all right, so let's try this one again. So I already have my negative out there. So there's that negative. And then I plug it in. 5 minus 1, that'll give me a positive. And 5 minus 8, that gives me a negative. So now I've got 3 things to multiply, right? I've got a negative, a positive, and negative. So that's going to give me a positive answer, right? I've got 2 negatives in there. Let's do the next one. Again, I always have my negative. So that's going to be there. I'm going to plug in 10 just because I like 10. So 10 minus 1, that's going to give me a positive number. And then 10 minus 8, that's going to give me a positive number. So anything that I plug in bigger than 8 is going to give me a negative number. All right. Last thing we're looking at now is my inequality. So my inequality has to be greater than 0. So greater than 0 is going to be, I'm looking for stuff that's positive. What about my 0? Do I have an equal mark? I don't. It didn't say, this did not say greater than or equal to 128. So it's got to be positive and not 0. Okay, so the positive one is this right here. Remember my 5, my 1 and my 8 gives me 0, so I know it's not going to be that. So if I wrote it in interval notation, it would be that, 1 to 8. But this is a word problem. So what's the answer? When will the projectile be greater than 128 feet above the ground? Well, let's think about my projectile. Here's my projectile. Here's the ground. 128 feet would be, let's say, maybe right here. So my numbers, this is 1 second. So in 1 second, it gets up to 128 feet. And then it keeps flying. And then when it gets to 8 seconds, it's back down at 128 feet. And then it hits the ground. So when is it above? When is it up here? It's going to be between 1 and 8 seconds. All right. So our last part is we are going to solve inequalities again, just like we did here with our positive negative chart, but we're not going to have a quadratic. Instead, we are going to have a rational equation. Okay, so when we did this before, we solved the equation, right? We solved this equation, set it equal to 0, and solved it and got our 2 answers. Okay, so the way that we're going to do it here is we're going to look at the top and the bottom instead. Okay, so I sort of made a chart here. We're going to look and see what makes the top 0, and what makes the bottom 0. Let me write that in blue. Sorry. All right, so let's see what makes the top 0 and what makes the bottom 0. Okay, so what makes the top 0? The top is never going to be 0. I should write it up here. What makes the top equal to 0? It's never going to be 0. Never going to be 0. So the top is always going to be positive, right? It's always going to be positive. Let's see what would make the bottom equal to 0? Well, that's x minus 3 equals 0. So that would be x equals 3. So I'm going to put 3 on my number line. Okay, if anything made the top 0, I would put it also there. So now I'm just going to split that thing in the middle. So I have from negative infinity to 3. That's the left hand side, and the right hand side is 3 to infinity. So I know my answer is going to be one of those two, or maybe both. And I don't know if it's going to be brackets or not, but we're going to figure that out. Okay, so now we just need to find the sign. Well, the sign, if I pick anything in here, and notice that I've got a 0 in here. If I put, this is always going to be a 6. Notice the top will always be a 6. So the top is always positive because that's a positive 6. Now I'm going to put my 0 in the bottom. All right, so when I put my 0 in the bottom, 0 minus 3, do you notice that that's a negative? So now, a positive divided by a negative, my final sign is going to be a negative. Now let's look to the right. Let's grab a number that's bigger than 3. Again, I like to use 10. If I put 10 in the top, it doesn't matter. It's always going to be a positive. If I put 10 in the bottom, 10 minus 3 is going to give me positive 7. I don't care about the 7. I care that it's positive. And then positive divided by positive is a positive. All right, and then the last thing we've got to do is figure out what the well, we'll come back to that. Let's look and see what my answer needs to be. Notice this says greater than or equal to 0. So greater than 0, that means it's going to be positive, or equal to 0, it could be equal to 0, right? So positive or 0. So do we have one that's positive? Yes, this sign right here, that right there. Okay, so I know that my answer is going to be 3 to infinity, and infinities always get a parentheses. Okay, but I don't know about my 3. So what I need to do is put this 3 in and see what I get. Okay, so if I put a 3 in the top, it doesn't matter because the top is always going to be 6. So the top is always 6. And the bottom, what's the bottom going to be? 3 minus 3. Do you see it's going to be a 0? So I have 6 minus 0. I should probably do that in a different color. But anyway, that is undefined, right? So the final side, it's undefined. If you put a 3 in there, you've got a problem, right? So 3 cannot be an answer. So that means this one is also going to be parentheses. If it's undefined, you will always have a parentheses at that point. Okay, so that's my final answer from almost 3 all the way up to infinity. All right, let's work the final problem. Actually, I think we have 2 more. Yeah, 2 more. Okay, 2 more, 3 more. No, 2 more. All right. Okay, so again, when you have a rational equation, you're going to look at the top and the bottom. So let's see what would make the top equal to 0. I'm going to solve it. 18 minus 4x equals 0. So that gives me what, negative 4x is negative 18. Divide by negative 4. And I get x is 18 fourths, which I could reduce, right? 18 fourths is 18 fourths. As 2 goes into it, 9. 2 goes into it, 2. So 9 halves, that's about, what, 4.5? About 4.5. All right. So now let's go to the next one. The bottom. What makes the bottom equal to 0? And that's x minus 3 equals 0. So that's going to be 3. So I'm going to put those two on my chart. Positive, negative chart. So I have 3, and my lab always likes to leave it as a fraction, but it's 4.5. Okay, so my intervals going to be negative infinity to 3. 3 to, they like it 9 halves, but 4.5. 9 halves or 4.5 to infinity. So I now, the one or more of these is going to be your answer. Okay. All right. So now I'm going to find the sign. I need to find the final sign of what this is going to be. Is it going to be positive or negative? So usually I just separate that. I'm going to have the top minus 4x, and then the bottom x minus 3, and then my final. All right. So let's do that. Okay, let's go ahead and plug in a number. Let's see, a number between negative infinity and 3, so that will be 0. So I'm going to plug in 0. When I plug in 0 on the top, I get 18 minus nothing, so that's going to be a positive. Don't write 18, just positive. And then on the bottom, 0 minus 3, that's going to be a negative. So my final sign is going to be a positive divided by a negative. That's going to be a negative. I do the same thing here. Remember, this was between 3 and 4.5, so I'm going to plug in 4. All right, so I'm going to plug in 4 into this one. 18 minus 4 times 4, 18 minus 16. So that's going to give me a positive 2. I don't care about the 2. And I'll write that down, how I got it. 18 minus 4 times 4. But you don't have to write that down, just for your notes. Now let's do the bottom. The bottom is x minus 3. So my x would be 4. So 4 minus 3. 4 minus 3, that's going to give me a positive number. So positive divided by positive. So the middle is positive. And now let's look at the last one. 4.5 to forever. Again, I like to use 10. You can use whatever. So 18 minus 4 times 40. That's definitely going to be a negative number. And then let's do the bottom. 10 minus 3. 10 minus 3, that's going to be a positive number. So a negative divided by a positive is negative. All right, so again, let's go back to my original. This is greater than or equal to 0. So greater than, we're looking for the positives, and it has an equal to. So we're looking for equal to as well. So I only have one place that I have positives. So that's right here. So my answer is going to have a 3 and a 9/2. Okay. I've got to see about the ends. Okay. So I'm looking for something that is 0. So I'm going to plug in my 3. So when I plug in my 3 on the top, I don't really know what number that is, but it is a number. So I'm just going to put it's some number. And then when I put the 3 on the bottom, it's divided by 0. Do you see that some number divided by 0 is going to give me something that is, my 3 is going to be undefined. Undefined. So that means my 3 is going to get a parentheses. Okay, now let's plug in this guy. That's 4.5. Okay, so 4.5, look up top. Do you notice that I solved this and got 4.5? So when it was equal to 0, I got 4.5. So that's going to be 0 on the top. Now I'm going to plug in 4.5 here. 4.5 minus 3, I don't really care what the number is, but I know it's a number. So that's going to be 0 divided by a number. That's going to be 0. Now, notice that my answer that I'm looking for is positive or equal to 0. Do you see that this one is equal to 0? I guess I should do that in red because it works, right? So there's my equal to 0. So 9/2 is in the solution set. So this is my final answer. All right, last one. And notice this says, be careful with your endpoints. Solving rationals, because notice that I have, sorry about that. Notice that I have one of my answers had a parentheses on it and one had a bracket. Okay, so just be careful. Okay, so this says solve this inequality. Well, the step 1 is to write this inequality set equal to 0. Okay, so you could plug that. So I'm going to go straight to writing it. If I move this 6 over and got common denominators, I'm going to go straight to this. On your test, I'm not going to give you one like this. I'm going to always make it equal to be 0 for you. All right, so once again, we're going to start with the top. So I need to see where the top is equal to 0. So minus 6x plus 19 equals 0. So minus 6x minus 19 divided by 6. Whew. So I get what, 19/6. That's one of my answers. 19/6 is about, what is that, about 3 1/6? 3 1/6. That's just so I know where to put it on my little number line. Let's look at the bottom. What makes the bottom equal to 0? And that's going to be 2x minus 3 is 0. So I move my 3 to the other side. I divide by 2. So I get x equals 3/2. So 3/2 is about, what, 1.5? All right, so let me go ahead and make my number line, my little chart. And I'm going to put my 1.5 first. But again, my lab likes for you to write 3/2. And then over here, I've got 3 1/6. So that's 19/6. So I'm going to write my interval notation up on top. So anything to the left of that 3/2 is negative infinity to 3/2. Then my in between is 3/2 to 19/6. And then the right-hand side is 19/6 to forever. So I know that my answer is going to be one or more of those guys. All right, so now I'm going to figure out what the sign is in each one of those cases. So I usually just do the top. Here's my top is 6x plus 1, and the bottom is 2x minus 3. So I usually do one at a time. Figure out the top is positive, the bottom is negative, or whatever. And then I find my final sign for my answer. All right, so again, and I'm going to sort of rewrite that. If that's okay with you. I'm going to go ahead and write this as about 1.5, and I'm going to write that as about 3 1/6. Okay. So I need to pick a number that is less than 1.5. Well, 0 is less, so I'm going to plug in 0. When I plug in 0 to my top, notice I get a 1, right? 6 times 0 plus 1. So that's going to be a positive. Now, when I plug in 0 here, I get -3, so that's going to be a negative. So anything in this interval is going to be a positive divided by a negative, so that's going to be, my final sign is going to be negative. Let's do one in the middle. I need to pick a number between 1.5 and 3 1/6. 1.5 and 3 1/6. So maybe 3. Doesn't really matter, but let's pick 3. All right, so I'm going to plug 3 in here. So that's what, 18 plus 1? That's going to be a positive number. And then I'm going to put a 3 in here. So 2 times 3 is 6. Minus 3, that's going to be a positive number. So a positive divided by a positive is a positive. And then the last one is any number that's bigger than 3.5. I always choose a 10. Doesn't matter, though. All right, so that would be what? 6 times 10, 60 plus 1. That's definitely positive. And then on the bottom, 2 times 10, 20 minus 3. That's going to be a positive. So positive divided by a positive is a positive. I think I messed up. Let's see. Let's put a 10 in the top again. Is that right? That should be right. 60 plus 6. Yeah, that's right. Okay. Got a negative, positive, negative. How did I get in my notes, I got a negative on top. That's because I left off my negative. That's why. Oh, yeah. Sorry about that, y'all. I'm supposed to be using this guy, and I used that guy. So that's supposed to be, goodness gracious, you could tell I've been making these for a while. So that should be -6x plus 19. So when I plug those in, if I put in a 0 there, I still get a positive. When I put in a 3 here, I still get a positive. But when I put a 10 here, I'm going to get a negative. So sorry about that. All right, so that's going to give me a negative. So that's a negative divided by a positive. So that's going to give me a negative here. All right, sorry about that. Okay, now let's look at what I have been I'll do this one. Let's look at what I've been given. I want something that is less than or equal to 0. So less than is going to be something negative, or equal to 0, or 0. So my negative, notice I have 2 of those. All right. So my answer is going to be -infinity to 3/2. And it's going to be 19/6 to infinity. I know my infinities get the parentheses, so I'm going to go ahead and put that on. Now we have to figure out what happens at 3/2 and what happens at 19/6. So when I put my 3/2 in here, so I'm going to put my 3/2 in this one. Now notice 3/2, that was not the answer to the top. So I don't really have to figure out what it is. I just know that it's going to be some number. okay? But what gives me a 0 is my 3/2 on the bottom. So I got a 0 on the bottom. So this one is undefined. So that's undefined, which means it can't be an answer. That's going to get a parentheses. Now let's plug in my other one, 19/6, or 3 1/6. So let's plug that in and see what I get. Notice when I plug in 3 1/6, that was my answer to make the top 0. So that means this is 0. That means that it's not 0 on the bottom. That's going to be a number. So a number divided by 0 is actually 0. So it could be negative or equal to. So that one gets a bracket because it is included, and I always put my little Matthew in there. So this is my final answer. So here's what to watch out for. Huge trap. Notice there's 2 stars, and this is written in bold, okay? So you need to check the sign of the answer on your number line. If it is undefined, like this one right here, if it's undefined, then your answer is always going to be open. Or another way to say that is going to be a parentheses, right? If it's 0, okay, and it has an equal mark, it's going to be closed. In other words, it's going to have a bracket. If it's 0, so these guys, this one was a 0. Let me show you. This one was a 0, and I had an equal mark. So if it's a 0 and you have an equal mark, you are going to have a bracket. That's what that is saying. But what if it's 0, but there is not an equal mark? So I think we did one of those. Did we do one of those? I don't know. Maybe we didn't. Okay. If you get a 0, so let's say that this last one we did, the example number 10, if it did not have an equal mark there, in other words, if it was just less than, like that, it didn't have an equal mark, then you are not going to have a bracket, okay, because it's going to say just negative, not or equal to. So if you have a 0 but you don't have an equal, then it's open, or another way to say that is parentheses. So basically, the only way that you are going to get this, where you have a bracket, is if you have an equal to mark and you have a 0 right there. Okay. All right, so that is the end of section 1.7.